This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can buy all the cards in this video at cardkingdom.com. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone. It's Friday and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. This week we're looking at an entire card type. This is something I've done already for things like artifacts, sorceries, and planeswalkers, and today we're looking at enchantments. This list was the most work-intensive one I've ever done because so many cards were eligible for it. There are over 2,000 enchantments in all of Magic. And in this video, we're going to talk about the 10 enchantments that have left the biggest mark on Magic's competitive history. Before we get started, a quick reminder on how I score these lists. Pro Tour, Mythic Championship, Legacy, and Vintage Championship events are all worth 2 points, and a Grand Prix Top 8 is worth 1 point. Before we get into our actual top 10, there is one notable exclusion I think we need to talk about because I don't think a video about the enchantments that have had the biggest impact on the game would be complete without it. That card is, of course, NECROPOTENCE. While it only has 35 points and the cutoff for this list ended up being 49, I think an argument can be made that this enchantment was one of the most impactful enchantments ever. Heck, maybe I should just make an entire video about Basically capable of drawing you as many cards as you want every turn, NECROPOTENCE was absurdly powerful, but it was a card that people almost universally panned when they first saw it. You have to skip your draw phase and pay life to draw cards? That hardly seemed worth it to people, according to the major gaming magazines of the time anyway. But this card really drove home the point of card advantage and brought it front and center in Magic in a way that it just hadn't been before. It sounds strange to us today to think that people didn't value card advantage since it is such a huge part of the game now, but people really didn't know how powerful it was. If they did, how could something like Ancestral Recall have been printed, a 1-mana draw 3 spell, if people, including designers, understood the power of card advantage? Well, NECROPOTENCE made people understand that in a new way. It was worth skipping your draw step, it was worth losing life to do it was worth having to wait until the next end step to get to draw the card, and it was worth the risk of your opponent blowing up NECROPOTENCE before you could get your new cards. This was especially true for aggressive decks, who could just unload their hand on the board and then start using NECROPOTENCE to make sure they continue to have threats. Your opponent used a board sweeper? No problem, pay 7 life and draw 7 new cards. NECROPOTENCE-powered aggro decks were the first thing to emerge, and emerge they did in the standard format of 1996 and 1997. This is a period often known as Black Summer, because the entire standard format was warped around decks that ran NECROPOTENCE and decks that tried specifically to beat NECROPOTENCE. In 1997, NECROPOTENCE decks also emerged in Extended, where they dominated between 1997 and 2000. It was then that Wizards finally took action. In 2001, NECROPOTENCE was banned in Extended, and it remained on the ban list for the next decade until Extended ended in 2011. They also banned it in Legacy, even though no one was playing it there at the time, just to make sure no one ever would, and it was restricted in Vintage. Since 2001, when the ban hammer came down across multiple formats, NECROPOTENCE has been quiet, with the one exception being a Vintage Championship Top 8 in 2013. I think it is probably safe to say that without Wizards taking action, NECROPOTENCE would have made the list, and even though it doesn't, it definitely needs to be mentioned in a video about the best enchantments ever. Alright, now let's move to the list proper, to number 10. At number 10, we have the only legendary enchantment to make the list, and the only double-faced card too, and that's Search for Azcanta, which transforms into Azcanta, the Sunken Ruin. Also, the newest card to make the list, Search for Azcanta is part of a cycle of double-faced legendary enchantments that flip into legendary lands, and of that cycle, Search for Azcanta has proven the most powerful, at least thus far. While it is on its enchantment side, it gives you some nice card selection while also helping you get closer and closer to transforming it into Azcanta, the Sunken Ruin. Once you get there, you get a land that gives you both card selection and card advantage. It has had a lot of success in Standard, primarily in control decks like Blue-White Control and Jeskai Approach. It also saw play in God Pharaoh's Gifts decks, which had the graveyard synergy and wanted to put cards in their graveyard, so it worked extra well there. In Standard, since Amonkhet rotated out, it still sees play in Izzet and Jeskai Control and picked up a top 8 at the last Pro Tour. It has already found homes in other formats too, such as in Grixis Control, Lantern Control, and Blue-White Control in Modern. Search for Azcanta also works nicely in Legacy Miracle decks, since it gives you a bit of control over what's on top of your library. Overall, the Search is still seeing a lot of play, and in the next few years, it could really solidify its position on this list, instead of just barely making it like it did today. At number 9, we have a card that can completely transform a game of Magic, and that's Standstill. Once you play this, Magic turns into a game of chicken, where both players have to decide whether or not they want to give their opponent 3 cards, or if they can afford to continue to not cast spells. Generally, the person playing Standstill can take most advantage of it since their deck is built with Standstill in mind. Meanwhile, Standstill effectively shuts the opponent down or forces them to give you insane card advantage. It saw a bit of play in both block and standard. Blue-green Madness decks in block like running it in the sideboard. In standard, it picked up one Grand Prix top 8 in the sideboard of a Psychotog deck, but it saw no play in extended. Basically, this is one of those cards that it took people a little while to figure out how to make use of it. Once they did though, it became quite powerful. That's why it sees a lot of play today in both Legacy and Vintage. Its most popular home in both formats has been the pseudo-eponymous Landstill deck. This deck is loaded with things that aren't technically spells but can still win you the game. This includes creature lands, hence Landstill, as well as cards with effects when you cycle them, such as Decree of Justice. This deck countering your turn 1 play and then dropping a Standstill on turn 2 is utterly devastating because you were then faced with a horrible option of letting your opponent draw 3 cards or beating you to death with Mishra's Factory. It's a pretty interesting deck, and one that has managed to be relevant in Legacy consistently since 2005. It's going to continue to be relevant in Eternal format, so it may have a shot at moving up this list. At number 8, we have a card that was part of a powerful combo in both Standard and Modern, and until it got banned in Modern, and that's, of course, Splinter Twin. When combined with creatures with an Enter the Battlefield ability like Pestermite or Deceiver Exarchs, Splinter Twin can create infinite copies of the creature with haste, because each new Pestermite untaps the one with the aura on it and just keeps going. What's more is, Pestermite and Deceiver Exarch both also have Flash, so flashing one of them into play on turn 3 at the end of your opponent's turn, and then untapping and putting the twin on it turn 4 was a pretty common play pattern. Decks running the Splinter Twin combo were often more or less blue-red control decks that can beat you in a variety of ways, with Splinter Twin being the route they take when they aren't disrupted at all. Splinter Twin had some success in Standard, but there it could only be played alongside Deceiver Exarch, making the combo a little less consistent. This led to it only getting a single point in that Standard format. Modern is where Splinter Twin really shined, where it was one of the format's top-tier decks between 2011 and 2015 when Splinter Twin got banned. A Splinter Twin deck even managed to top 8 the 2015 Legacy Championship, but it never really became a fixture in that format. Since being banned in Modern, Splinter Twin has not found a home anywhere, and ultimately its position on this list could be in danger, especially since Standstill and Search for Azcanta are both seeing plenty of play right now. At number 7, we have the oldest card to make the list, and that's Sylvan Library. As you can see, this card came out way back in 1994 in Legends. As you can also see, the wording on the card is incredibly confusing and kind of hilarious. I mean, it says you lose 4 lives. How about some quality control? Anyway, let's look at a more recent reprint where this card actually does make a little more sense. Alright, there we go. So yes, Sylvan Library is an incredibly powerful card. It lets you draw 2 extra cards a turn. And yeah, sure, you do have to pay 4 life for each of them if you want to keep them in your hand, but even if you choose not to, it gives you some powerful card selection, since you can also choose to put the card back on top that you draw normally. The card advantage this card can grant you is frequently going to be worth 8 life. Sort of like we mentioned with NECROPOTENCE earlier, people did not immediately realize how strong this card was. As a result, Sylvan Library didn't see any play until 2 years after it was printed, after people realized the power of card advantage thanks to NECROPOTENCE. It first saw play in green-white aggro decks that finished in the top 8 at Pro Tour New York in 1996. This was a good place for the library. Aggro decks, of course, want to win the game quickly, and providing you with extra cards is a good way to swarm your opponent. Soon thereafter, it started seeing play in Extended, primarily in the Oath of Druids combo deck. Another deck that wanted to win quickly, so going down on life didn't matter as much as finding your combo pieces by drawing the extra cards. The Eternal formats are where the library has had the most success, though. In Legacy, it's primarily seen play in aggro decks like Zoo, Jund, and Delver. In Vintage, it's seen play recently one of the decks that it saw play in way back in the 90s, and that's an Oath of Druids deck. At number 6, we have the only mind control effect to make the list, and that's Threads of Disloyalty. While it is obviously a pretty narrow mind control effect, since it can only steal creatures with converted mana cost 2 or less, it is still an incredibly powerful version of this effect. Effects that steal creatures are powerful because they allow you to develop your board while taking away from your opponents. It's almost like you're playing a creature that says, when this enters the battlefield, destroy target creature and create a copy of it. And yes, this one is a narrow version of that effect, but 3 mana to steal a 2-drop is still a great deal, especially in formats that have powerful creatures that cost 2 or less, like Tarmogoyf, Delver of Secrets, and Young Pyromancer. It first saw play in Standard control decks, and Extended it saw play in Fairies and in Tron decks. As you probably guessed from the examples of creatures it can steal that I gave you though, it's done the most in Modern, a format loaded with powerful 2-drops. At number 5, we have the only multicolored enchantment to make the list, and that's Detention Sphere. Detention Sphere not only comes with the powerful exile effect that enchantment-based removal spells frequently bring, but it also exiles any copies of the card your opponent might have. This can be particularly strong against multiples or tokens, especially tokens, because those don't ever get to come back, even if the sphere is destroyed. It had 3 top 8s at the Block Pro Tour in Esper Control decks, a deck that was effective in Standard too, but it also saw play in other control builds like Bant and Jeskai in Standard. In Modern, it continues to see play today in Blue-White and Jeskai control decks. At number 4, we have an enchantment that turns out creatures, and that's Bitterblossom. A powerful turn 2 play, Bitterblossom quickly fills the skies and makes spot removal horrible. This one card gives you so many cards worth of value that losing 1 life every turn just doesn't matter. You're going to win the race pretty easily since the Bitterblossom also quickly gives you more than 2 mana's worth of power. The power of this enchantment was further enhanced by the fact that Fairy Tribal decks were incredibly good in Block, Standard, and Extended, so most decks that ran this even got some extra value out of the creature type. In Block, Bitterblossom managed 9 Grand Prix top 8s, all of them in Fairy decks. The majority of its appearances in Standard were also in Fairy decks, but it also saw some success in Black-Green Elves and Black-White tokens. The card was incredibly dominant, the best indication of which may be that at Worlds in 2008, 7 of the top 8 decks were running Bitterblossom, a pretty good sign that the card was just a bit too good for that Standard environment. It, of course, also saw play in the Extended version of Fairies. When the Modern format was created in 2011, Bitterblossom was preemptively banned because Wizards was concerned that it would be too good for the format. In 2014, it got unbanned, and since then it hasn't been a dominant card, but it has found some success. In metagames where spot removal is heavily played, cards like Lightning Bolt, Path to Exile, and Fatal Push, Bitterblossom can really shine. Since being unbanned, it has seen play in decks like Jund, Affinity, and Vengevine. It has even had some modest success in Legacy, with most of its success coming more recently in Grixis Delver and Death's Shadow decks. At number 3, we have the only enchantment creature to make the list, and that's Courser of KRUPHIX. The Courser is probably my favorite card to have made the list. I love value engines like this. Playing lands off the top of your library can sound unassuming at first, but this is the kind of card that once you play with it, it's clear just how powerful it is. If you can play a land off the top of your library, that effectively means you're drawing a card. This piles up value in a hurry, and over the course of the game, it will give you several cards worth of value. It doesn't hurt that it has nice defensive stats and also gains you life every time you play a land either. It's a control player's dream. All of that added up to make the Courser see a lot of play as one of the best cards in its Block and Standard formats. Like Bitterblossom, the Courser saw an absurd amount of success. At Pro Tour Journey to Nyx in 2014, the Block Pro Tour, the Courser was in 7 of the top 8 decks. In Standard, its primary home was a deck loaded with the best cards in Standard, Abs and Midrange. It also saw play in Devotion to Green and Sultai Whip. These days, Courser is seeing play in Modern in decks like Jund, Scapeshift, and toolbox decks like Collected Company and Court of Calling. At number 2, I've actually included 3 cards, but that's because they are all heavily played sideboard hate cards, and I didn't really want 3 of those taking up 3 spots on the list, so I decided to talk about them together. They are Rest in Peace, which is the actual number 2 on the list in terms of its score, Stony Silence, which would have been number 4, and Leyline of the Void, which would have been number 5. Rest in Peace is one of the best ways to hate on graveyards in non-rotating formats because it not only gets rid of everything already in the graveyard, it makes it so that nothing else can go into it. It has been a fixture in the sideboards in Standard, Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. Stony Silence, meanwhile, hates on artifact-based decks, especially in Modern. Turns out, most artifact-heavy decks are pretty reliant on using their activated abilities. While Rest in Peace has seen a lot of play in several formats, Stony Silence has been played the most in a single format, in Modern, where it can really bother decks like Affinity, Hardened Scales, Lantern Control, and Tron, turning off the abilities of cards like Arcbound Ravager, Walking Ballista, and Codex Shredder is pretty nice. It has seen play in other formats like Vintage and Legacy, but it does so much less frequently. Leyline of the Void, like Rest in Peace, hates on graveyard strategies. While it costs twice as much mana and doesn't exile cards that were in the graveyard already when it comes into play, the fact it can come down for free before the game even starts helps balance that out a little bit. It also doesn't mess with your graveyard, so if your deck is interested in doing that but you want to run graveyard hate in your sideboard, Leyline of the Void is for you. There weren't graveyard decks for it to hate on in Standard or Block, but in Extended it came along at the right time to combat the early dredge decks. In Modern, it is run less frequently than Rest in Peace, but recently has seen a bit more play as the graveyard-focused Hollow One decks have started putting it in their sideboard to combat the Mirror and other graveyard decks in the format. It also sees a fair bit of play in both Legacy and Vintage, where there are plenty of degenerate graveyard strategies. And at number 1, we have an enchantment that's a removal spell, and that's Oblivion Ring. While this wasn't the first version of this effect we ever saw, for that you have to go back to the obscure and way more confusing Oubliette, Oblivion Ring has become the most iconic version of this effect, leading to people calling any enchantment that exiles something while it stays in play an Oblivion Ring effect. Its flexibility to hit any type of permanent makes it very nice, and that flexibility and efficiency has led to it seeing a ton of play since it was printed in 2007. It has seen play in every format that awards points in this video series except for Vintage. In Block, it was featured in Kithkin aggro decks. In Modern, it was seen in Tron and Eldrazi aggro. In Extended, it was featured in Blue-White Control and Naya Burn. In Legacy, it has seen play in Death and Taxes and Miracles. Standard, though, is where it has done the most. This is in part because it was legal in Standard for a really long time. It was first printed in Lorwyn, but was also reprinted in Magic 2012 and 2013. This means that it was legal for most of the Standard formats between 2007 to 2013. In all of those standards, it was a very useful removal spell, and its ability to exile all kinds of permanents made it see a lot of play. Despite all of its success, its position on this list may be somewhat vulnerable, as since 2013 it has only added 4 points to its score. Cards behind it, still seeing play regularly, could overtake it at some point. Well, that does it for this week's MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.